She was just the maid, invisible, disposable. Even the man she loved walked away when she needed him most. But a single photograph, a scar, and a DNA test would flip everything upside down. What happens next will leave you speechless. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the grand estate as Maria quietly scrubbed the marble floor, her knees aching, her hands raw from bleach. For 5 years, she had served this family without complaint, cleaning rooms, preparing meals, and caring for their aging matriarch. Yet today, the warmth in the halls had turned to ice. A golden brooch had gone missing, and before any investigation, all fingers pointed to her. Maria turned to her boyfriend, Caleb, who worked in the estate's security team. He knew her better than anyone, or so she thought. Instead of defending her, Caleb stepped away, his jaw tense. "Maybe she did it," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Her heart shattered in that moment, not from the accusation, but from his betrayal. She stared at him in disbelief, her throat tight with tears. "After everything," she whispered, but he had already turned his back. By evening, her belongings were stuffed into a bag and tossed by the door. Rain began pouring, matching the storm inside her. As she stepped out into the cold night, her shoes soaked within seconds, Maria felt smaller than she ever had in her life. With nowhere to go, she walked aimlessly, the estate behind her now just a memory, a place where loyalty meant nothing, and love disappeared the moment it was tested. Her only regret wasn't losing her job. It was believing she had someone who truly cared. At the last minute, she turned back, desperate for one last glimpse of the only home she had known in years. That's when she spotted the attic light still on and the door slightly ajar. Drawn by a strange pull, Maria slipped inside one final time. No one noticed as she tiptoed up the stairs and into the attic filled with dust, memories, and things long forgotten. Amid boxes and broken furniture, something glimmered, not gold, but a photograph. She picked it up, and her world stopped. Maria clutched the photo as the wind howled outside. What was this? Who was this woman, and why did they look identical? Her hands shook, but in her heart something awakened. A spark, a question, a buried truth beginning to stir. She didn't know it yet, but this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of everything. Maria left the estate for good that night. Her bag was light, but her chest carried the crushing weight of shame, betrayal, and confusion. The streets were quiet except for the steady patter of rain, glinting in the street lamps like falling shards of glass. She walked for hours, not knowing where she was going. The photo in her pocket seemed to burn against her skin. It was a clue, maybe the only one, and though her mind raced with disbelief, her instincts screamed it meant something. By dawn, she reached the edge of the city where the buildings turned from mansions to cracked facades and forgotten alleys. She took shelter under the rusted awning of a closed bakery, watching the world slowly stir to life. No job, no home, no one to call. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the photograph again, now slightly warped from the rain. The scar on the woman's shoulder, so identical, haunted her. Had her whole life been a lie? Had someone taken her from somewhere she belonged? 2 days passed. Maria found temporary shelter at a women's aid center. The volunteers offered food, a bed, and more importantly, kindness she hadn't felt in years. One social worker, Elise, noticed Maria staring at the photo for hours. Gently she asked, "Who is she?" Maria didn't know how to answer, but after a long pause she whispered, "I think she might be my mother." Elise's eyes softened. "Then let's find out," she said, and with that a journey began. Elise arranged for a free DNA ancestry kit, something Maria never imagined doing. It felt surreal, spitting into a vial and sealing it, hoping it might return something more than just science. Maybe hope, maybe truth. In the meantime, Elise helped her find a part-time job at a flower shop. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave Maria a small sense of control again. For the first time in weeks, she woke up to something more than sadness. She woke up with purpose. Every night, Maria returned to her cot and held the photograph. The scar, the eyes, the haunting familiarity. She replayed Caleb's betrayal in her mind, but it hurt less now. He had left when things got hard, and that said more about him than about her. She was not broken. She was rebuilding. And even if the DNA came back with nothing, she had already found something more powerful, the will to never let anyone define her worth again. 3 weeks passed before the email arrived. Maria had almost forgotten about the test, buried beneath long shifts at the flower shop in the quiet rhythm of recovery. The sun was just rising when she opened the results, her hands trembling. Words began to form on the screen and her heart nearly stopped. A 99.9% DNA match. The woman in the photo, Claudia Whitmore, daughter of a shipping tycoon, was her biological mother. Maria sat frozen. Her mother wasn't just real. She returned to the photograph and flipped it over. There in faint ink was a date and a name. Claudia and baby, 1997. That was the year Maria was born. How had she ended up in foster care? Who had separated them and why? Elise helped her piece together the public records, adoption files, and old news clippings. It painted a heartbreaking picture. Claudia had disappeared for 2 years after a scandal, re-emerging alone, unwilling to speak of where the child had gone. Maria could barely breathe. The people who fired her, accused her of theft, looked down on her. They were her family, and they had no idea. She wrestled with fury and sorrow. She thought of Mrs. Whitmore, the aging woman she had helped bathe and feed, who always stared at her like she was a ghost. Maybe she had recognized something, some trace of Claudia. Maybe the truth had been lurking just beneath the surface all along. Elise urged caution. This could destroy them, she said gently. But Maria wasn't looking for revenge. She wanted answers, closure. She needed to know why she had been left behind. And so one quiet afternoon, she dressed in the same modest clothes she'd worn as a maid, took the photograph and DNA report and returned to the estate, not as a servant, but as a daughter demanding the truth. The same gates that once closed behind her now stood open. Inside, the house seemed unchanged, but Maria saw it all differently now. Every hallway echoed with silent lies. She walked past stunned maids and into the sitting room where Mrs. Whitmore sat by the window, a blanket over her knees. Their eyes met. Maria stepped forward and held out the photo. "Do you remember her?" she asked. The old woman's hand trembled as she reached out. Her lips parted in a whisper. "My Claudia," tears filled her eyes. "And you're, oh God." That was the moment everything changed. The past returned, uninvited and undeniable. And Maria, once discarded, now stood at the heart of a family she never knew, one that owed her not just an apology, but the truth they had buried for far too long. The silence that followed Mrs. Whitmore's realization stretched long and heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. She motioned for Maria to sit beside her, trembling fingers brushing across the photograph again and again as if willing it to speak more than it already had. "You're her child," she whispered, her voice cracked and aged. "You're Claudia's girl." For a long time, neither woman spoke. Then Mrs. Whitmore turned her face to the window. "They told me you died." Maria's heart ached. "I didn't," she said softly, "but someone made sure you thought I had." Elise, who had accompanied her quietly, stepped forward and laid the DNA report on the table. "This confirms it. Maria is your biological granddaughter." Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled as she held the paper, her face pale. A family that had built its name on wealth and reputation had buried its darkest truth. Someone had lied. Later that day, the Whitmore family gathered in the parlor. The air was tight with tension, every eye turning to Maria as if seeing her for the first time. There were gasps, stammered denials, even outrage, but Mrs. Whitmore silenced them with a single look. "You will all sit," she commanded, stronger than anyone expected. She pointed at her eldest son, Richard. "You told me the baby died. You and your wife said it was a stillbirth." Richard's face turned ghostly white. The truth spread like wildfire. Claudia had given birth in secret, under pressure from the family to disappear while they handled things. Maria had been handed off to an orphanage under a false name. Claudia, broken and manipulated, was told her child died and never recovered. She vanished for years, resurfacing only to find her child gone and no one willing to speak of it. Maria listened in disbelief, piecing together the fragments of a life stolen before it even began. "I don't want your money," Maria said, her voice calm but resolute. "I don't want your pity or your guilt. I want the truth. I want justice for the mother you silenced and for the little girl you discarded." The room fell still, and for the first time Maria didn't feel powerless. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was the living proof that even the deepest lies can be unearthed. And in that moment she realized something else. She had a name, a voice, and a strength they could never erase. The news spread beyond the estate walls like wildfire. The tabloids picked up whispers of an illegitimate heir, though none knew the truth. Maria, once invisible in her uniform, now found herself the center of scandalous speculation. But while the world gawked, Mrs. Whitmore acted swiftly. She summoned lawyers, drew up statements, and by the end of the week, Maria's name was formally added to the Whitmore family registry. It was official. She wasn't a maid anymore. But power came with pressure. Reporters camped outside the gates. Extended relatives, once indifferent to her presence, now watched her with guarded eyes. Her days were filled with meetings, legal documents, and press avoidance. She missed the simplicity of the flower shop, the quiet anonymity. Most of all, she missed the certainty she once had, however small. In becoming someone of worth in their eyes, she feared losing who she had always been. Then one afternoon, Caleb appeared. He stood outside the estate's iron gate in a cheap jacket, holding flowers. Maria saw him through the window, her stomach knotting. Elise advised caution, but Maria decided she needed closure. They met in the rose garden where once she had planted flowers to forget her sadness. Now the blooms were in full color, like a reminder that time, though cruel, also heals. Caleb's face was a mask of regret. "I was wrong," he said. "I let fear guide me. I let you down." Maria didn't flinch. "You didn't love me," she said. "You loved the version of me you could control. When I needed you most, you stood by and watched me fall." Caleb's eyes watered, but she didn't let it sway her. She had cried enough tears for him already. "You made your choice, and so did I. I'm not going back." He left with his head bowed, and Maria stood taller than ever. That chapter was closed. That evening she sat alone on the estate balcony, staring out at the city skyline. Despite the wealth, the name, the legacy, she felt a strange emptiness. But it wasn't sadness, it was clarity. She had come so far, yet something within her remained untouched, waiting to bloom. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Elise appeared, smiling. "There's someone downstairs asking for you. Says he met you at the flower shop." Maria's heart skipped. When Maria descended the grand staircase, she felt more nervous than she had in any press conference or family meeting. There, standing awkwardly in the gilded foyer, was Daniel, the soft-spoken man who had once bought sunflowers from her every Sunday. He was the kind of customer who always tipped too much and spoke too gently, like the world didn't rush him. He wore a simple wool coat, damp from the evening drizzle, and held a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. Not roses, not lilies. Maria smiled, unsure of how to respond. Daniel wasn't like the others. He hadn't come for answers or favors. He didn't even glance at the opulence around them. "Would you like some tea?" she asked. In the cozy side room that once served as the house's reading nook, they sat across from each other. Maria half expected the conversation to turn toward headlines or scandals, but Daniel only asked, "Are you okay?" It was the simplest question, and the first one that felt real in weeks. They talked for hours, not as heiress and admirer, but as two people who remembered simpler days. Maria told him about the attic, the photo, the discovery. Daniel listened without judgment, without awe. "You're still you," he said, and she believed him. It had been so long since someone saw her heart before her surname. As they spoke, the walls of the estate faded. She was just Maria again, the girl with calloused hands and a stubborn heart, not the center of a legacy. Over the next few weeks, Daniel returned often. Not every day, not out of obligation, just enough to remind her that she didn't have to walk alone. He brought her books. He helped her sneak out of the mansion to walk through the old flower market. They laughed about how neither of them knew how to live in a world of tabloids and chauffeurs. And with every meeting, something inside Maria softened, not into weakness, but into something brighter, something called hope. Then one evening as they walked through the Whitmore garden, Daniel paused beneath the arbor covered in wisteria. "I don't care about your name or your past," he said, voice steady. "I just know I'd like to be a part of your future if you'll let me." Maria looked at him, not at his clothes, his job, or what the world might think, but into his eyes. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a girl proving her worth. She felt like a woman finally choosing what she deserved. As the days passed, the novelty of Maria's new identity began to fade, but Daniel remained constant. Unlike others who now called her Miss Whitmore with rehearsed smiles, he still called her Maria with a quiet reverence. He didn't flinch when she shared the darker parts of her past, the loneliness of foster homes, the heartbreak of betrayal. If anything, he leaned in closer as though every scar made her more worthy, not less. In his presence, she didn't have to pretend to be polished or poised. One evening, Maria invited Daniel to a formal dinner at the estate, a public gesture that turned heads. The room was filled with relatives and socialites, many of whom had once dismissed her presence. Whispers followed her like shadows. Yet Daniel, in his modest gray suit and unrushed demeanor, walked beside her as if he belonged. Some guests scoffed. One cousin even muttered, "He doesn't fit our image." But Daniel didn't blink. After dinner, they escaped to the estate's conservatory, where moonlight bathed the greenhouse in silver. Daniel sat on the edge of the fountain, his hands clasped. "I know this world isn't mine," he said, "and I won't ever try to fake belonging, but Maria, I loved you before I knew who you were, when you smelled of flower and flowers, when your hands were tired and your eyes still burned with hope." Her heart stilled. He hadn't come for status, he had come for her soul. Maria's eyes welled with quiet tears. "Everyone else sees what I've become," she said. "You see who I've always been." Daniel smiled. "Because that's the woman I fell in love with." He reached into his coat and pulled out a tiny wrapped box. Inside was not a diamond but a silver sunflower pendant, a reminder of where they met and what really mattered. "No promises yet," he said, "just something to keep close." Maria clutched it to her heart. She had never felt so seen. That night, as Maria lay in bed, she thought of the girl she once was, scared, small, cast aside. And she thought of Daniel, who had found beauty in her broken pieces, who didn't wait for her to be wealthy or whole to offer his heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. Love rooted in truth could grow even through cracks, and Daniel hadn't fallen for the Whitmore heiress. He had fallen for the maid, and in doing so, proved he was worthy of her deepest, most enduring love. Maria stood before the estate's front gate one last time, the rising sun casting golden light on the mansion she once entered through a service door. In her hand, she held a sealed letter, the final step in her decision. She had spent weeks weighing her inheritance, the sudden spotlight and the legacy offered to her. But in the quiet moments, with Daniel beside her and the sunflower pendant resting against her heart, she realized power didn't mean peace. She wasn't seeking to rule the estate. Inside the house, Mrs. Whitmore waited in the sunroom, frail yet alert. Maria knelt beside her, took her hand, and placed the letter on the table. "This isn't rejection," she whispered. "It's release. I forgive you not because it was easy, but because I need to move forward. I'm grateful for the truth, even if it hurt." The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She didn't argue. That afternoon, Maria hosted a quiet gathering in the community garden behind the women's center. It was the same garden she once helped plant during her time at the shelter. Volunteers and old friends gathered, including Elise, who stood beside her with proud eyes. Maria announced the launch of the Whitmore Foundation for Forgotten Daughters, a nonprofit dedicated to helping abandoned or displaced young women rediscover purpose, identity, and dignity. Later, as she and Daniel walked through the flower market where they'd met, everything felt circular and new. She no longer needed the world's approval. Her value wasn't stamped on a check or tied to a last name. It was in how she rose, how she reached back to lift others, how she loved openly, deeply, without condition. Daniel took her hand. "You didn't just survive them, Maria. You outgrew them." She smiled. "And I finally became the woman I was meant to be." That night, under a canopy of string lights and wisteria, surrounded by friends and strangers she once served tea to, Maria stood beside Daniel and gave a toast. "I once thought I had to earn love, prove my worth, chase acceptance," she said. "But the truth is, we're never too lost to be found. We're never too broken to be whole again. And sometimes what the world throws away turns out to be gold." If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on even more exciting stories. Every like and subscription from you is a huge motivation for me to keep sharing great content. Thank you for watching.